So welcome everybody, my name is Simon Ruth. I am the CEO of Thorne Harbour Health and we're thrilled to be presenting this event tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on where you all are tonight as well, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners tonight, particularly Quality Australia and the Brave Network and SOJI survivors who have helped us pull this event together very quickly. As you would all be aware, there is legislation going into the Victorian Parliament, and this is an opportunity for us to have a discussion about how important that legislation is. The event tonight is being recorded and is in webinar format. Only the speakers are visible, but we expect the event to be up online across Thorne Harbour Health social media by the end of the week if you'd like to view it again or if you'd like to show it to somebody. If this event raises any issues for you, we'd Switchboard have been alerted to the event taking place tonight, and you can contact them on 1800 729 367. That was 1800 729 367, and they are more than happy to take your call. I'd also like to acknowledge that tomorrow is World AIDS Day. You'll see several of our speakers have red ribbons behind them. It is a very different world now to the world in which our organisation was set up, which has allowed us to branch out and focus on some other issues like this one, which is wonderful. But it's an important day in our annual calendar. It's also this week the International Day of the Disabled Person, and we'd also like to acknowledge that that's coming up on Thursday. But on to tonight. I'd like to introduce your moderator for the evening. The topic tonight is on conversion practices, and the format will be two presentations followed by a panel discussion of survivors of conversion practices. Tonight will be moderated by Adam Bourne. Adam is Associate Professor of Public Health and Deputy Director of the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University, and he's also a board member of Thorne Harbour Health. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Simon, for that illustrious introduction and the overview of what it is we're trying to accomplish today. I'm just really pleased to be able to chair the proceedings of this event. This is an issue of significant importance to a great many within our diverse communities, and the introduction of the bill into Parliament, I think, marks a really symbolic moment in our ongoing march towards equality and affirmation. I can imagine that not everyone who's with us today will have read the bill that's been presented. But as we set the scene for what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion, I wanted to highlight just two sections that I think particularly emphasize what a great many of us feel. In section 3 of the Act, which is the object of the Act, what it is it's trying to accomplish, it reads, "The objects of this Act are to ensure that all people, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, feel welcome and valued in Victoria and are able to live authentically and with pride." It goes on to say, "It is the intention of the Parliament to affirm that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity is not broken and in need of fixing, and to affirm that no sexual orientation or gender identity constitutes a disorder, disease, deficiency, or shortcoming." We all know this. Every one of us joining the webinar, I'm sure today, already knows this. I guess what's just so wonderful and affirming to see is this articulated so powerful in a bill before our own state's Parliament. As Simon indicated, there'll be two speakers today to help us get our head around what it is we're really talking about here, the notions and dimensions of change or suppression practices. And then a bit of an overview of what it is the bill before Parliament is seeking to accomplish as well. So the first of those speakers, I'm very pleased to introduce Chris Sabbs. Chris is a survivor of conversion practices and a leading LGBTQ+ advocate. He is co-founder of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Change Efforts Survivor Statement and co-founder of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Change Efforts Survivors Group. And Chris will be providing a brief presentation about what conversion practices are and the ideology that underpins them. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. I'd like to firstly pay my respects to the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as the land that I'm currently on. I've been asked to give a brief overview of what conversion practices in Australia are and the ideology that underpins them, and particularly what they look like in modern Australia. There are so many misconceptions about what conversion practices are, and some of them have stemmed from the name problem. So we've all heard it called conversion therapy. We've all heard it even called gay conversion therapy. And this has created probably the most common misconception, which is that conversion practices are always a type of therapy, which they're not, because they're not therapeutic or helpful. And the vast majority of conversion practices don't even occur in therapeutic settings. I often come across some pretty weird ideas about what conversion practices are. A lot of people think that conversion practices are things like lobotomies or electroshock treatments. I've heard more often than I can count that conversion therapy is an American problem. It doesn't happen here. I get asked quite often about why I decided to go to a Pray Away the Gay camp, which, by the way, I didn't. And recently I've seen a lot of conservative religious people pushing the idea that conversion practices are limited to coercive, forced practices that involve physical torture or loss of liberty and things like that. Conversion practices in Australia have looked like all of these things at some point. And around the world, there are absolutely still places where people are physically harmed and where that kind of thing is occurring with the aim of changing LGBTQA people. In Australia, electroshock treatments and live-in facilities absolutely have existed historically. However, what conversion practices looked like decades ago is vastly different to what they look like now. And it's been very important for us as survivor advocates to, of course, acknowledge the historical practices that have happened and the stories of people who have been through some of those shocking historical conversion practices, but also to make sure that we understand what we need to legislate against today to make sure that legislation is effective. Conversion practices have been around for a very long time, but at various times they've looked different. So media reports about extreme examples of historical conversion practices and movies like Boy Erased have absolutely managed to put the spotlight on conversion practices as a political issue, particularly in the last few years. But unfortunately, it's also made it really difficult for us as survivors and people that are trying to campaign for effective legislation, because there's general confusion, largely due to the media focus on some of those extreme examples about what conversion practices look like today. And that's why we started the SOGI Survivor Statement. We wanted to write a statement that would be by a collective of survivors, that would set the record straight, for want of a better term, about what conversion practices have looked like in the past, what they look like now, and also the steps that survivors believe need to be taken in order to effectively combat the movement. The SOGI Survivor Statement represents the combination of lived experience, expertise, research, and perspectives from long-term survivor support. We developed the statement according to participatory approaches to policy development and the principle that survivors and survivor experts are best placed to accurately define the movement. We had input from a very broad range of survivors from different cultural, religious, and LGBTIQA communities. And that was central when we were creating it. And that has actually resulted in a few edits over the last few years as we try to make it as inclusive and as accurate as possible. So I'd like to share with you the definition of conversion practices that SOGI survivors have. And that is any formal or informal practice, activity, or treatment in any setting that seeks or is used to suppress, eliminate, or change a person's sexual or romantic orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where that change is deemed necessary due to the instigator's belief in or adherence to conversion ideology. It's a mouthful, I know. One of the things that has been really key to the advocacy that we've done is to point out that all conversion practices are underpinned by conversion ideology, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And the reason that it's important for us to define that ideology is that while conversion practices have changed over time, so for example, there was a time when lobotomies were happening where there was electroshock treatment. Fast forward another decade, there was Pray Away the Gay camps, and in the 1990s it looked very much like Alcoholics Anonymous style support groups, and then now we have a lot more informal stuff happening within religious communities like pastoral care and things like that. But the ideology that underpinned all of those practices throughout that time has actually remained the same. So the conversion practices, the way that they look, the things that often the media will focus on, those things have changed throughout the decades. But the ideology that underpins those practices has remained the same. So understanding that ideology has been key and is key to recognising the more subtle and covert conversion practices that we see in modern Australia, particularly the ones that are masked as being religious in nature. So things like pastoral care and prayer ministries and things like that. These are some of the religious assertions that we call conversion ideology. I think one of the most, a couple of the most important ones are talking about how, about the nature of being LGBTQA+, that it's a form of brokenness or, something negative. There's also this idea of cause. So finding causal links between past experiences and being LGBTQA. So things like abuse or neglect, or your parents, or not being breastfed, or things like that. And I couldn't go list all of them, there's too many. Another lens that we can view conversion ideology, and this is just one thread in a really complex tapestry of intertwining beliefs and assertions, is false and misleading claims. So the claims that the conversion ideology make are not grounded in any factual or psychological or scientific evidence, and they have already been refuted by medical, psychological, and secular bodies as being damaging and unfounded. And these are those claims. So again, it's about this idea of causality and about the nature of conversion practices. And if you want to have a read of these more, please go to the SOGI Survivor Statement. There's a lot of detail in these. I'm not going to go over them now because there's just not enough time. So when we understand the importance of, I guess, understanding the ideology and how conversion practices have changed over time, and that obviously it's this ideology, these things, these messages that people hear that are actually the damaging part of conversion practices. So what does a modern survivor look like? So what is the typical modern survivor of 2020? We just created this advocacy tool recently for Amnesty International as part of their Right for Rights campaign. And we're really excited about it. I'm just going to show it to you very quickly. it illustrates what the most recent survivors of conversion practices have been reporting over the last 5 years. So this model is absolutely not definitive. A model like this could never actually capture every survivor's story. But what we have tried to do is explain in a really simple way the most common experiences that have been reported by survivors recently. So the typical survivor of conversion practices in Australia in 2020 is LGBTQA adult, the A stands for ACE, that has either grown up in or joined a faith community. They regularly absorbed messages, which we would call conversion ideology, so those things that were on the previous slides, from that faith community. And this often happens when they're quite young, but not always. And over time, of course, this typical survivor realizes that those messages and that ideology is actually about them. It applies to them. And they deeply internalize and believe that conversion ideology about themselves. Either through a direct request for help or maybe even via a referral from a religious leader. A pastoral leader or a religious person meets with them over a period of time for prayer or pastoral care with the aim to change or suppress their queer identity. They may have then been referred to another person for more of the same stuff. And this practitioner may even claim to be ex-gay or ex-trans themselves. And that's been quite common language in the LGBTQA conversion movement, ex-gay and ex-trans. And usually that is unpaid. Well, it's almost always unpaid. So conversations with these different, I'll call them practitioners, may have been exploring childhood trauma or abuse. So this is about that causality, finding that causal link for your LGBTQA-ness, and which of course encourages that person to find fault in their childhood or early experiences. And all of this, of course, is fueled by seductive messages in books and online materials, and even the occasional conference or gathering featuring success stories, and I'm saying that with inverted commas, of people who claim that they have become straight or cisgendered or that they have been healed. And over time, the psychological, emotional, and spiritual damage affects their ability to function and to live. And we know that those who do survive this, and please do remember this, this process generally is something that occurs over quite a prolonged period of time, like years. Those who survive report ongoing trauma, psychological harm, and they require significant long-term peer and psychological support. This is what modern conversion practices look like in Australia today. Of course, again, this is not definitive. There are other manifestations, and not everyone's story is the same. In fact, no one's story is. But this, I would say that this is a good representation of that ideology that does underpin all of those practices. So this is why SOGI Survivors recommends a multifaceted response to the problem of conversion practices. That includes legislation, which covers both formal and informal or non-therapeutic conversion practices, as well as those that occur in faith communities under the guise of pastoral care and prayer ministries and things like that. It also recommends things like survivor support, redress, public health campaigns, and further research. So that's a little overview. It was very quick, and I hope that it kind of gave you a little bit of a sense of particularly the ideology that underpins these practices. It's quite nuanced and can be quite difficult to understand if you haven't sort of grown up in a faith community. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was really valuable, and I've not seen that storyboard before. And like you said, there's a lot more diversity that exists within this space, but it's also still a really accessible way of people trying to wrap their head around what this looks like right now. And I've heard a lot of those same historical reflections, people assuming it means electroshock therapy or lobotomies, and of course the reality is somewhat different now. And that's a really nice way of trying to articulate that, and I can imagine this being useful for a whole range of stakeholders as we seek to engage parliamentarians, especially within this process.
Absolutely.
I think some of the other, there might well be some questions that people have to follow on from this, some of which I'm mindful are going to be picked up on by other members of the panel in just a moment. So for the sake of timing, we'll keep moving for now, but if there are questions directed to you, Chris, we can pick up on those in a little while after Ghassan has spoken. So, in which in fact leads me to our next speaker. Ghassan Kasasia is the legal director at Equality Australia. He's been involved in LGBTIQ advocacy for over a decade, including serving as policy and development coordinator at the New South Wales Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby from 2007 to 2009. Ghassan has taught public law, and has experience as a senior commercial litigator in Australia and overseas. Ghassan's going to provide us today with a legal analysis of the Victorian government's Change or Suppression Practices Prohibition Bill, and after which we're going to take the opportunity to ask a few technical or legal questions to Ghassan before heading into the broader panel discussion. So Ghassan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Adam, and good evening, everyone. I'm also going to share some slides, but before I do, I also wish to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I am currently standing. So I'm going to take you through the key aspects of the reforms that the Victorian Parliament will be considering, looking at the practices that are being prohibited, how the scheme will work, a short comparison with the other states, and also just briefly the process and expected timeline for the reform. Before I start, it's important to note that there's two aspects to the reforms. There's the part on conversion practices, which I'll come back to, but there are also amendments that are being made to discrimination protections, in particular the inclusion of a new attribute for discrimination, which protects people born with intersex variations from discrimination based on their sex characteristics, as well as updates to definitions of sexual orientation and gender identity in Victorian discrimination laws. But today, I'm focusing predominantly on the conversion practices scheme that's being implemented by the bill. And one thing to just remember as we go into the detail is that the scheme itself includes a compulsory 2-year review by an independent expert 2 years into the scheme's operation. And that review will look at things like the effectiveness of the scheme, the enforcement mechanisms, and a redress scheme, which are not part of the current framework. As Adam mentioned, the objects of the bill are expressed in lofty terms around the importance of everyone feeling welcome and valued in Victoria and being able to live authentically and with pride. And the intent behind the bill is very much around affirming that sexual orientation and gender identity doesn't constitute a disorder, disease, or illness, that efforts to change or suppress people's sexual orientation or gender identity does cause serious harm and is based on deceptive deceptive means, and they're harmful both to the person who's subject to the practice as well as the community as a whole. So looking then at how the bill defines what a conversion practice is, there's two parts to this definition. There is what is a conversion practice, and then there are two exceptions, which I'll come to. But at the highest level, what is not okay is a practice or conduct which is directed towards a person, whether with or without their consent, that's on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and is either for the purpose of changing or suppressing their sexual orientation or identity, or inducing them to change or suppress their sexual orientation or identity. So just pausing there, what is included is a wide range of practices, and the bill also gives some particular specific examples of what can include a conversion practice. That includes things like psychiatry, psychotherapy, consultations, treatments, or therapies that meet those limbs, but also prayer-based practices like, and also deliverance, exorcism, referrals are also included. And the important thing is it can include religious practices, but it's not limited to religion. So it can also include cultural practices that may be informed by other beliefs, but are for the purpose of changing or suppressing someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And importantly, it is directed towards a person. So the practice has to be directed at a person, not at people at large. And it doesn't matter the age of the person or the place that the practice occurs, so formal or informal settings. And it also doesn't matter whether or not the person themselves consented, because consent is a problematic notion here when we're talking about people who are being told deceitful and harmful and deceptive claims as part of these practices. So there are two exceptions, however, that are excluded from the definition of change or suppression practice. And these are two exceptions which are okay. So they're not prohibited. And the first is around supporting or affirming a person's gender identity or sexual orientation. And the bill provides a range of examples of that, including assisting someone who's affirming their gender, providing acceptance, support, or understanding to a person in respect of their gender identity or sexual orientation, or helping them to facilitate their coping skills or social support or identity exploration and development. The other exception is the reasonable provision of health services. It's important here that, it's important that the provider reasonably forms the view as a professional that the health service that they're providing is necessary, including to comply with a legal or professional obligation. So it avoids the definition avoids a health provider, for example, who has their own particular view about what's necessary. It still has to be a reasonable one that's judged in light of the practice of their profession. So the scheme has three main parts, and there is a series of criminal offences, which I'll come to, and there are then two aspects to the civil response. So the civil response, which is chiefly being given to the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission to oversee. In terms of the criminal offences, there are four key parts to them. There are offences around engaging in practices or a group of practices which cause either serious injury to a person or injury. And the penalties there are for individuals of up to 10 years imprisonment or a max penalty of up to $200,000 as a fine, or both. And there are even higher penalties for corporations. But these offences deal with serious injury, which means an injury or a cumulative series of injuries that endanger someone's life or that are substantial and protracted or that destroy a fetus. And the next tier of offences include injury, which is causing someone temporary or permanent physical injury or harm to their mental health. So if you engage in a conversion practice that causes serious injury or injury to a person, that is criminalised. There are two other key offences. One is around taking someone outside of Victoria for change or suppression practices, and the other is an advertising offence, and that is to advertise your intention of giving or making available change, effectively conversion practices. And that is actually a criminal offence of a maximum penalty of almost $10,000. And that can be prosecuted not only by police and a public prosecutor, but also by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. So moving away from the criminal offences, which deal with some of the more serious of and more difficult to prove aspects of the scheme, the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission also has a broader role in terms of investigations around serious or systemic practices, as well as a role in consent-based facilitation and education. So looking at the civil response, the Commission has an educative function. So it is being given powers to provide information and education to the public as a whole. It's been given research functions, which allow it to collect and analyse data, and also research matters which arise or are incidental to the Act. So that can be looking at things like the offences under the Act, whether the provisions are being breached in other contexts, and how effectiveness the Act has been. And then there are two aspects. One is an ability for any person, not only a survivor, but any person, to make reports to the Commission around conversion practices. Then the Commission can do things like request information. It can provide targeted education in respect of that report. It can engage in a voluntary for both the survivor and the person to whom the report is being made about. So the Commission can facilitate agreement making between those people and look at, for example, an agreement perhaps around ceasing the practice. It can look at reparation. It can look at really anything that the people voluntarily agree to. And the Commission can also refer matters that are raised in reports to other bodies that have other roles. So, for example, it can refer it to the police if it's a serious offence, or one of the offences that are dealing with the serious injury or injury provisions, or it can refer it, for example, to a health complaints commission or the regulator that's responsible for the national health practitioner bodies. And so what that means is that where we are looking at practices occurring, particularly in the health space, there's also a pathway back to existing complaints and disciplinary processes. The Commission also is being given stronger enforcement powers in cases where there are serious or systemic practices taking place. And in those instances, the Commission's given power to compel, that is, force someone to provide information or provide documents or even attend to give evidence in person. It can then make agreements with people around their behaviour. It can accept what are called enforceable undertakings, which are effectively enforceable promises by a person not to repeat conduct, but they can include all sorts of things like to give compensation, to publish apologies or notices around things that they've done. It can also include a review mechanism so that the Commission can monitor, for example, whether they've complied with what they promised they would do. And it can also issue compliance notices, which are effectively a notice that says that someone has breached the Act. And these, both the undertakings and the notices, can be enforced through a tribunal process. And that tribunal is called NCAT, which is a civil and administrative tribunal based in Victoria. looking just across at different states. So we've had some reforms in the ACT recently and earlier in Queensland, and just some of the ways that the Victorian scheme will be different to those that have come before in the ACT and Queensland. One of the most significant things is, unlike the ACT, the Victorian scheme applies to both practices that change or suppress sexual orientation or gender identity, and they apply, like in the ACT, in any context. While in Queensland, we had them limited predominantly to health services, although that was broadly defined. The Victorian scheme will have criminal offences that are applicable not only to children and people with impaired decision-making ability, but to all people, similar to Queensland. But they will also have a range of civil processes, like those educative research functions, as well as the voluntary facilitation function and investigation and regulatory enforcement in cases of serious or systemic practices. So in terms of where the bill is at, it's been introduced in the lower house of Victorian Parliament. We expect that to pass this year. And then it will move next year to the upper house, where numbers are very tight. The government requires the votes of the crossbench if the Liberal Coalition Party don't vote for the bill. So it is important that the community gets behind this bill and ensures that their MP and in time the upper house MPs are encouraged to vote for the bill. And to that end, there is on our website at the moment a ability for people to write to their MPs. So equalityaustralia.org.au/nconversionvic. So if there's a moment of your time could be spent in the next couple of days to write to an MP now and ask them to support the bill. And we will be speaking and obviously working with survivors and the Victorian Pride Lobby and others in making sure that the upper house is also in support of the bill. So I'll hand back to you, Adam. I'll stop the slides. That was it for the presentation, but I think there's some questions that have come through.
Yeah, that was great, Ghassan. Thanks so much. It's hard to break apart that kind of legal technical detail into an accessible format, but I thought you did a really great job there. There were a few questions that have come in, one of which was relating to a comparison with this legislation to that in the Queensland and the ACT, but I think you've quite adeptly covered that one. A second question was which asked which commission you're referring to, which, as I understand it, is the Victorian Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission, is who you were referring to in that regard. Yep. Okay,
yes,
great.
that's correct.
Cool. And then 2 or 3 other questions that are kind of a bit meatier. And one came through from Lucia Scarlett, who's noted that while it was lovely to see the inclusion of asexual and aromantic people in the presentation that Chris did in some of that imagery and conceptualizing, but Luciella notes that the draft bill doesn't seem to include asexual or aromantic people. And is there a reason from your perspective why they haven't been in the bill, or is there an opportunity to add them?
I think that's a really important point, Luciella. Sorry, it was Luciella.
Luciella, I think, yes.
Luciella, and it's an issue that we've raised around the definition, particularly of sexual orientation. I don't think there's any reason why it's not, and I hope to see that there will be some confirmation, perhaps in the debate around the intention to actually include the A, if I can put it that way, in that definition. So I don't think there's any reason why it shouldn't be included, and I would encourage you to write as well to your MP to make sure that it is.
Great, thank you. And I'm conscious that Percy, one of our Percy Gertler, might also be picking up on some of these issues in the panel discussion that follows in just a moment. Another question asked by Henny Castro was how the practice can be monitored when the practitioners are not recognised as registered professionals?
Another great question. The important thing is the definition of conversion practices goes across all people. So you don't have to be a health practitioner. It doesn't matter whether you're registered or not. If you are a health practitioner that's registered, the Commission, that is the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, has the ability to investigate and then refer the matter on to the health regulators. But in the event that it isn't a health professional, you can still have the facilitation process that the Commission is able to engage in. If there's an offence that's been committed, they can refer it to police. It doesn't matter whether the person's registered or not, and anyone can make a report to the Commission. It can also investigate if there are serious or systemic issues in question as well. So it does cover whether registered or unregistered.
Great, thank you. And we'll just take these, there are just two more that hopefully we can squeeze in. Beth Barnett has asked what parameters of advertising are specified.
I will have to, can I take that on notice and come back?
Of course you can.
But it is broad because it talks about notices and prohibition on making notices and communications. And also I should have said, actually, conversion practices can be online or in person. So it is, again, a very broad definition, but I'll come back with more specific.
That's fine, Ghassan. It's a lengthy document. We don't expect you to know every single word in detail. That's fine. But just one last question I think we have time for, perhaps from Carl Hand, who's asked, what's the definition of suppressing? And the question was there and then just disappeared from my screen.
Whether it was
would this include supporting religious practices such as celibacy or waiting until marriage?
So the second reading speech makes clear that that might be a form of conversion practice if it meets those definitions. So it's a practice directed at a person with or without their consent that is on the basis of their sexual orientation, and it is for the purpose of suppressing or inducing them to suppress their sexual orientation. So unfortunately, until the scheme is in operation, we're not going to be able to know exactly when a practice of telling someone to refrain, for example, to be celibate, will amount to a suppression of their sexual orientation. But I suppose the risk is in the person who's making that statement. If they cause that person harm or serious injury or any injury, mental health injury as well, that's temporary, they could actually be meeting the criminal definitions if they are negligent as to that risk. So I suppose the important thing there is that generalist statements of belief are not being targeted by these provisions, but that more directed practice doesn't have to be repeated. It can be a single practice, although a group of practices as well can also be a conversion practice. But to a degree, we're going to have to wait and see how it looks on, when it actually plays out. But I doubt that there would just be an isolated instance like that, because I think you have to look at the context, who's speaking it, the context in which it's said, to work out whether or not it was for the purpose of changing or suppressing someone's sexual orientation.
Okay, that makes sense. That understanding that broader context, I think, is something that's kind of spoken to in a whole variety of sections of this bill. Thank you, Ghassan. That was a really excellent overview. And again, thank you for making it so accessible for those who might not be so familiar with a lot of this technicality. So at this point, we move on a little to what is, I think, an excellent panel lineup of people from all across the community, our varied communities within Victoria. Some of whom I've been honoured to have worked with in the past, and some people who are new faces to me as well, as I'm excited to get to know. So how this is going to work is that I'm going to introduce each of them in turn and ask each person a specific question before looping back round to ask some further questions of them. And then there's an opportunity for everyone in the audience to ask any questions to any member of the panel. And there's time at the end, we hope, to allow for that question and answer back and forth dialogue as best we can within this webinar format. So the first of our panelists speaking this evening is Nathan Despot. Nathan is a steering committee member of the Brave Network and co-author of the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Change Efforts Survivor Statement. Nathan endured 10 years of conversion practices in his teenage years and his 20s, and is determined to ensure secular Australia understands the harms that conversion practices have on LGBTQA+ people. Nathan is a policy and research manager in the sector and also a member of the LGBTIQ Health and Human Services Working Group. Nathan, thank you very much for joining the panel this evening. We've just heard a lot from Ghassan about the detail of the bill, what it's technically seeking to accomplish and its provisions. What, from your perspective, and perhaps from Brave perspective, needs to happen in addition to this legislation?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so Brave has been advocating for change in this area for about 6 years or so, and before that, groups like Freedom to Be, and our focus has been survivor support predominantly. A group of organised survivors that have been navigating trauma and complex and family issues and the pain that comes with that. And so, over time, this has grown into a snowball and of support and other voices supporting us. And I can definitely say that, the legislation is not the main focus, and has never really been the main focus of our advocacy. It's been really preventing the harm and raising awareness. The bill is so strong, it covers referrals, it covers advertising of both paid and unpaid services, which I hope also clarifies one of the questions that was asked earlier. So it's quite powerful. We also feel like it makes that distinction and allows that distinction that was possibly being struggled to be made a moment ago, that there is a big difference between, suppressing your behavior and your sexual activities and actions. There's a big difference between that and suppressing, supporting someone or trying to help someone to suppress their experience psychologically of their sexual attraction, orientation, and their gender identity. There's such a huge difference. And so, celibacy is one thing, but actually suppressing your experience of the world or attempting to do that requires a lot of deep, harmful intervention into a person's psyche. And what we've seen, I guess, is that has been what has driven so much of the harm and concern, with survivor groups. And we want to make sure that even that bit of nuance is not lost, even in this discussion in Parliament, so that we don't have confusion around what suppressing means, for example, because the harms are quite different, What we'd like to see moving forward, in addition to this, though, is that we know that people from non-Western backgrounds, the non-Western Christian backgrounds, have experiences that are really quite different to a lot of Western Christian people. And so, we want to make sure that these voices continue to come forward, but it's been a very slow trickle until recently because of the fact that there's such risk and danger there. So we want to make sure that those voices are supported to come forward, particularly where it's harder to just, separate ideology, theology, or the rest of it, like much more interconnected belief systems there and much more risk. And so we want to make sure that more work is done there in that community, and also for bringing forward the voices of trans and gender diverse people whose experiences are really diverse and often lost in this conversation. We also want to see that ace and aero people, who have been a large part of Brave, are not forgotten. In all of our work, the A is always there in the acronym. We've never talked about punishment really until the last year or so. We've never talked about redress or penalties or retribution. That's not something that survivors talk about much, even though I think sometimes it's assumed by the religious right that we sit around sort of, scheming about punishment. Actually, what people want is to thrive and live and survive, and not see our friends and loved ones live horrible lives that are, tortured in the effects of the harm they've experienced. We want to see that psychological support that's often hard to access and quite expensive. We want to see that more available to survivors. We'd like to see a public health campaign as well. We want to make sure that there's a stronger awareness of what is conversion ideology. That what we know from research increasingly is that there's something particularly diabolical about that message that you are disordered or broken, as opposed to, you're going to hell, you're a sinner, you're a puff, or things like that. Like, there's something diabolical and extremely harmful when someone internalizes this idea that they are disordered. We don't really understand why yet, what the mechanism of that harm is, but we know that that is horrendous, and we want to make sure that is more widely known. And I guess we also want to make sure that this idea that LGBTQA plus people are broken or disordered, that is recognized as vilification, really, and that's really important, I guess, for us. And then lastly, I'd say that we want to make sure that some of the practice guidelines and codes of ethics that already exist in this country, that they're properly enforced. If a psychologist, for example, or a registered professional, and it's different to pastoral care workers, but if a registered to an LGBTQA plus person to make an informed consent decision, or they fail to refer to someone that is confident, competent, and experienced and affirming, then that's technically malpractice. Like, you can't, if that failure to refer is something that really should be monitored, and it's not appropriately in this country at the moment. So I think there's regulatory sort of work that needs to happen there too. So there are quite a few things that need to happen, but I think this bill, as being pretty much one of the best in the world, really lays the foundation for that work that needs to happen in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathan. I mean, as always, there's just 1,001 things. I think I'd love to follow up with you there and ask more your thoughts on this. You have such a history working in this space. One thing that I was particularly attentive to in you talking was the need to ensure we're hearing from and are engaged with a range of multicultural communities from non-Western and non-Christian perspectives. And so it's with a kind of we're really grateful and a nice segue to our next panelist, and great for me to be able to introduce Asia Zaharin. Asia is a PhD candidate and board director of the Forcibly Displaced People Network, and a committee member of the Australian LGBTIQ Multicultural Council, AGMC. Asia's research includes political science and history, decolonization, and the intersection of LGBTIQ+ and Islam, with a focus on reducing social inequality and promoting social responsibility. Being an intersectional feminist allows Asia to share her lived experience and learnings through her academic activist performance. Asia, thank you again so much for joining us this evening for this. And I guess I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the experiences of culturally diverse Australians with conversion practices, and perhaps a little about some of the misconceptions that people might have about Muslim communities in relation to conversion practices.
First of all, Adam, thanks so much. Actually, my name is pronounced as Aisha.
Oh my gosh, I am.
Yeah, that's like a wrong pronunciation. That's okay.
Terribly
that's
apologetic.
I don't mind actually, because So
sincere apologies.
So what I can say, as being a Muslim, there are most prevalent misconceptions about LGBTQ people, that they think LGBTQ people and Islam, they are mutually exclusive. Which is not really true, because if you look at the Quranic verses, like there are plenty verses in the Quran which God says that gender barren peoples and exist, as in there's one particular verse which God says God can create people as in males and females, or peoples in between, and also people who actually non-procreative people, and that could include gay and lesbian, and also trans people. And also in a different verse, you can actually see how God mentions like they are actually men who are not attracted to females, so that could include trans peoples, and also gay or enox, or people like they don't have, so gender variant peoples, and sexual orientations, as in like LGBT people does actually mention or acknowledge in the Quran in particular setting. And second of all, that leads to another big misconceptions where a lot of Muslim in the current setting, they believe that these kind of situations that LGBTQ people experience actually induced by demons. So they have to have like interventions or God interventions in a way that there's a practice called ruqya where the healer would recite a particular verse of Quran in the hope that it will make the demon who possess this particular person, as in go back to quote unquote normal. And it's kind of like wrong because if you look at in his and also like other misconceptions that they have, that they think homosexual behavior is actually concept that is introduced by the West, whereas it is not actually, because if you look at into history, homoerotism happens in pretty much a lot of Islamic civilizations in the past. So it's not something new. It was actually introduced by colonialism back in the 19th centuries, where they introduced laws such as the what is it, the Act 377, if I'm not mistaken. So this kind of law criminalize homosexual behavior. And also other things that Muslim people don't realize is that the concept of homosexual that is mentioned in the Quran, in the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah, or the prophet of Lut. It is nowhere that is similar to the current situations of homosexuals behavior that we have right now. So what we have, what is condemned in the Quran is actually pretty much what they did was, as in the peoples of Lut, what they did was sexual violence. Like they were actually cis-hetero men try to rape and to put dominations against other men, which is not even, like from the LGBTQ, which is probably cis-hetero, other cis-hetero men. So they were actually, they were punished because of the accumulations of different sins, not of the particular homosexual behavior in the current setting, though they're not totally, there's two different things. You can actually differentiate between sexual orientations as we have today, or sexual violence, because that was actually what was condemned in the Quran.
Thank you for that. And Aisha, I'm so sorry for pronouncing
That's all right.
your name wrong at the start there.
That's okay.
There's a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A board already, and I just encourage other people listening in to chip in any thoughts or ideas that they're having as this is going on, and we can try to pick up as many of those at the end as possible. But for now, I'll have to move swiftly on to our next speaker, our next panelist, sorry. Percy Gertler is an academic and advocate from Naarm, Melbourne. Percy is an avid Twilight fan and a beach lover, and recently completed their honours thesis about religious themes in queer pop music. They've been a steering committee member of the Brave Network for 3 years, where they've co-written policy submissions for the Victorian government and provided peer support for survivors. Percy, one of the things I think that's come up a lot in the discussion already today, and also really just speaks to the meaning and the foundation of organizations like Brave in the first place, is this notion of being a survivor. And I guess I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about what does support for survivors look like?
Yeah, so I've been on the steering committee of Brave Network for about 3 years, and in that time learnt that there are two really key elements to survivor support, particularly in Brave. We support Christian survivors of conversion practices. The first one is really important, is psychological care, psychological support, and that which I think Nathan has already touched on, is that it's very expensive, very hard to access. But there are multiple ways that it's difficult to access, is that it can be really tricky to find adequate psychological care for conversion practices. And that's partly because it might be assumed that a queer counsellor or a queer psychologist or someone who specifies in queer issues would be perfect for survivors, but it's actually not the case. What we know is that the most important care is trauma-informed care, and that we really often survivors really need care where the professional has an understanding of conversion ideology or religious ideology, and also doesn't assume that the queer person will want to be secular, because that's often the case, is that survivors may want to maintain their faith or may have got into conversion practices because we really believed in our faith at the time and believed in the conversion ideology that we were taught. And the second thing that we really see is that recovery, or the best recovery of survivors, is through peer support. And so that's a really, really key element. So at Brave, a lot of what we do is peer support. And what that entails is giving space for survivors to share experiences, to deconstruct the conversion ideology that we were taught and grown up with and sort of stewed in for many years. And yeah, it's sort of helping survivors to understand what we've been through, and that's something that peer support is really good for.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Percy. I think many of us will recognise the challenges in accessing mental health support within the community generally, but support, particularly when you're a survivor of conversion practices, you know, I can fully understand is just that much harder, and the recognition of the value of this peer support approach, I think, is kind of really good to elevate and introduce into this discussion, which again leads quite neatly on to our next panelist. Nicole Connor is the founder and principal counsellor at Defining Stories. She's a qualified narrative therapist based in Fitzroy North. Nicole was born in Germany and raised in South Africa, and she brings 30 years of experience of working in not-for-profit organisations and spiritual care, and specialises in working with people who've been negatively affected by toxic religious experiences, anxiety, grief, and/or trauma. Nicole, sounds like a wealth of experience that you've had there in a whole range of different contexts. Can you perhaps just share with us some of your experiences in supporting survivors?
Yes, thank you so much. Can I just quickly say that the observations or the remarks I'm about to make come from a place of two particularly lived experience. One as a narrative therapist, and secondly, as someone who was in church leadership in a conservative Pentecostal mega church here in Melbourne for over 30 years. So I continue to be rather flummoxed that there are still conservative religious organizations and or churches that would deny the existence of these conversion practices or ideologies that are prevalent to this day. And perhaps even more serious, deny the tremendous harm done by these ideas. Lives have been lost and people's mental health has been put at great risk because of conservative religious ideas around what it means to be LGBTIQA+. Most often, people seeking my help from negative effects of ideologies they've encountered in religious conservative spaces, you know, for me, often churches, suffer the effects of chronic and complex trauma. They've been exposed to multiple traumatic events or messages throughout their lives, and it's often been repeated and prolonged. And I guess just the epicenter of this toxic messaging in conservative religious settings that clients have often encountered and absorbed from the time that they can remember, for some of them, is the message that says that heteronormativity is the default, normal, and preferred mode, and anything else is unnatural, undesirable, and that there's something intrinsically broken for those, and I quote, who experience these, quote, unwanted same-sex attractions, as it's often put, through 1,000 different ways, from church settings, prayer meetings, sermons, Christian school chapels, youth groups, books, conferences, family and church friends. The message it becomes clear. It's like oxygen. To be LGBTQIA+ is not natural, not God intention in any way, and needs to be fixed or sorted. And in some extreme cases, the message becomes quite hideous, that God is angry with them and that they will go to hell. These messages also come with a real threat, the threat of what people will face if they dare to come out. If you do, you'll not belong, not be included, not be sheltered, but rather you'll be sidelined, regarded with suspicion and or marginalized. For many of the people I see and the ones I've spoken to, these threats have become a reality. In a sense, these constructed religious ideas built on belief systems of interpreting the Bible in a certain way results in tribal behavior that ousts and shames the person who dares to step out of the church's constructed, religious organizations' constructed ideas around sexual orientation and gender identity. That person faces shaming, exile, and betrayal. Their whole sense of self is called into question by the very people that have told them for a very long time that they love them, that they are family, and that they belong. I cannot speak strongly enough about how devastating this is. These conversion practices and ideologies lead to depression and anxiety and a plethora of other trauma-related effects. And there are many who are no longer with us because it all became too much. For me, this bill cannot be implemented fast enough.
I mean, thank you, Nicole. That was so sobering, I guess I would say, and a really powerful reflection on experiences that clearly so many people gathered here have had, from the many nods I saw around the screen as you were talking, and also there were some comments coming in on the board as well saying how you were describing exactly the experience that they had had as well. Thank you for that. Our next panel member is Alex Butler, who is a bi+ Christian woman who uses she, her pronouns, a ceramicist, a proud cat mum, and an LGBTIQA+ advocate. Alex is a steering committee member of the Brave Network and a survivor of conversion practices within the evangelical churches of Outer Eastern Melbourne. Alex, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this panel discussion. Can you maybe talk us through what conversion ideology looks like in faith communities that you're engaged with in 2020? What does it look like in this kind of modern day era?
Lovely, thanks, Adam. Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I think has been covered from a few different areas. So I come from like an evangelical Christian perspective. That's my lived experience and my area of expertise within the Brave Network. I really hope that others have a chance to go into theirs a bit deeper, so we do get a broader range as well when it comes to the question time. I want to say that I'm going to be discussing ideology, not theology. Conversion ideology is not directly biblical, but aspects of it can be extrapolated from people's faith practices, traditions, learnings, and teachings. I'll also be speaking in binaries when it comes to gender, as they are the only option that conversion ideologies accept to be correct. Chris outlined earlier that ideology and practices have changed and evolved over time. What I experienced, 10 or so years ago has changed to what's experienced now. And I guess I want to take some time to go into some of the more nuanced part of the ideology that does saturate and really permeate through Christian faith communities today. It's already been said, but conversion practice ideology is pinned upon the premise that LGBTQIA+ people are not an intended part of God's design or diversity and do not fit into God's plan in a positive way, which, I believe to be very wrong. Ideology is presented most of the time in a very subtle and nuanced way that really does permeate the way through the faith communities. Sometimes queer people are directly spoken about. Normally, when it comes up in the news, or when a bill like this one is introduced, it suddenly becomes the topic that is the flavour of the month to speak about. And most of the time, it's a whole load of indirect messaging, little subtleties through sermons, through small group discussions or studies, in church culture, or what is deemed to be okay or not okay for people to do depending on what their assumed gender is. Yes, there's theology surrounding what it means to be made in the image of God, but it's the ideology that stems out of that and what is assumed from traditional teachings from different periods of time and culture that deeply affects queer people of faith that are hearing, experiencing, and are feeling these messages through interactions within their faith communities. Whilst gender and sexuality are very different aspects to people's identities, when it comes to conversion ideology, a lot of it overlaps and conflates. Questions like, what does it mean to be a man of God or a woman of God, reinforces gender stereotypes, but also then what those stereotypes are meant to be attracted to. So it's people in the opposite gender and how they interact within their own gender and sexuality. A man of God is to be someone who is strong, is to take care of his family, isn't to be pulled into the temptation of pornography, and is to love his wife and children. Meanwhile, a woman of God is to be someone who is compassionate, hospitable, passionate, and is to support her husband and children. These are the stereotypes that I knew that I grew up with and other people grew up with as well at the moment. They all drive towards the right way of living and thinking, towards a straight and cisgender life. And that's what everyone should strive to be within the Christian church. And anything apart from that is deemed to be ungodly. I want to put everyone into, I guess, like a metaphorical situation. It's the classic youth or young adult once a year event that happens where the guys are separated to one side and the girls are separated into a different group. It's their once a yearly talk about sex and relationships that is saturated with messaging about what a girl shouldn't be thinking about and what boys shouldn't be doing. A lot of that is sort of what girls are thinking and what guys are doing, when it's quite the opposite sometimes. You sit there and you hear peers talking about how they're struggling with a crush on a boy and wanting to stop their lustful thoughts, and you're awkwardly thinking about the girl opposite you. The shame sets in really quickly, the guilt, thinking that you're terrible, you're unworthy of love from anyone else or from God. You sit there and you bury the feelings deep down. Every time these topics come up or someone asks you, who are you into? You push the feelings deeper and deeper down, knowing that they're somehow inherently wrong, even though they're a part of you. These topics become something that you shy away from, or it's something that you've got, I guess, a bit of a performance or script around, so you can say what you think you should be saying, or finally it comes spewing out and you tell someone your most innermost thoughts. And if you're not in a faith community that's fully affirming, you'll most likely be led into the beginnings of active conversion practices. Within 2020, being gay or lesbian means to be leaning into the idea that your desires are inherently wrong, but you can change them, or at least choose to suppress them and to lead a celibate life. If you trust God enough, pray hard enough, have enough faith, are open to enough, I guess, change, that anything is possible. Eventually, you'll be able to find the love of your life, someone who's of the opposite gender, and your relationship will be fulfilling and whole. Or at the very least, you'll be able to suppress your thoughts and feelings and lead a celibate life focused solely on God. But then enter in a bisexual person, someone like myself, and conversion ideology has hope for you. You're one of the lucky ones. You've got at least some sort of correct feelings or desires, the ones for the opposite gender. But then you also have the incorrect ones that might be framed as something that is just purely lustful or a temptation you need to overcome in order to properly have a relationship with someone of the opposite gender. I went through my teenage years and my early 20s playing it straight because I was able to. I internally deemed that that was easier than trying to navigate the entirety of my sexuality. And bisexuals of faith, generally speaking, have experienced one of those two narratives, either playing it straight or trying to make it so that you are straight. You're only connecting with that part of yourself, or seeing it as a temptation you need to be working through. Both of these narratives within conversion ideology are extremely harmful. Trying to suppress part of your sexuality not only condemns part of you, but can just really rock the world around you and how you interact with it, along with those who are gay or lesbian, who are told the entirety of their sexuality is wrong, broken, and flawed. Those who are trans and gender diverse, who are told that they are flawed at the most center and core part of who they are. Those who are asexual and aromantic are being told that they're either very broken because they don't feel things, or that they're extremely pure and godly because they don't feel those things. These ideologies cause people, these ideologies that cause people to try to suppress or change their gender or sexuality are extremely dangerous and erodes people's sense of self and happiness, impacting negatively on their mental health, but also their connectiveness to their faith community and their faith itself. So yeah, I'm very excited for this bill to come in and to see the great change that it will make within faith communities, not only of the Christian faith, but wider faith as well.
Oh gosh, thanks so much, Alex. I mean, that again, I think that the story you tell there so beautifully resonates with a great many people on the panel, and also in the audience. There's been some comments coming in from people even within different faith communities, saying just how much what you're saying, kind of how it sits with them and reflects very real experiences that they had as well. Thank you for sharing that. Moving swiftly on, in the interest of time, I'll introduce our next panelist, Abhinav Saad. Abba is a young gay Coptic Christian and survivor of conversion practices performed by a senior Coptic psychiatrist. He sits on the Victorian Government LGBTIQ task force and founded Queer, Middle Eastern and African Christians in Australia to advocate and support this community. Abba, something that's been picked up on a few different people is the way in which conversion practices look rather different now than perhaps they did in the past. They're not always quite so explicit or overt. And in fact, the term underground is used quite often to describe the ways in which conversion movements are operating. So I guess that's my question to you really, is how do you see the movement of conversion practices operating nowadays?
I just want to start off by making two quick acknowledgements. One to my fellow panelists for their wealth of experience and the fact that we're present as survivors. I think that's quite a powerful statement. And the second one is to those in my community who are hiding in the shadows without a face, without a voice, and have commonly been forgotten or erased in the story, as seen as a Western construct, like one of the other panelists made mention. So for them, I'm here, and even though it's quite painful for me to be present, so those are my two acknowledgements. As for the underground, I think one of the major ones is if, for example, you go to a Coptic school or a faith-based cultural school, like I did growing up or through my schooling, and then you say you go to a Coptic church through Saturday and Sunday. So Monday and Friday, you're a Coptic school, and Saturday and Sunday, you're a Coptic church. You know, gay is sin, queer is non-existent, you're going to go to hell, or there's something wrong with you, there's something broken. It's not just at a Sunday school, or it's also in teaching. It's also in your peer communities at school. And because family, social connection, belonging, identity, faith are all housed together, there can be no way out for you. So it goes underground in those contexts, whether it's that you need to stand up and carry a family name, or whether you need to not be like the other Western people and be a pure, say, Egyptian or Greek or Russian, wherever it may be. So you need to stand out from that group. It also comes in theological terms. So that God didn't want this to happen. If it were to be examples in the Bible, or be, queer saints, for example, or why did people successfully manage to get out of it, and why haven't you gone out of it for? Or the more common one that happens in these communities is just the phase. You'll grow out of it, or God will deliver you. So when it's hidden in these kind of contexts, it's also very easy, especially in multicultural, multi-faith communities, where language can play a part. So my suspicion is that, say, the Copts and other groups who deem that gay people don't exist, while on the same token make rules for gay people, which I don't understand. If they don't exist, why make rules for people that don't exist? My assumption is that they will use technical languages, either theological or cultural, or in their own, like say in Arabic, for example, and find a loophole out of it, for example. And the real fear of going underground is that once you've made it very clear that you're going to lose family, belonging, identity, your social space, I guess, and maybe even your faith, then you're probably more likely or not to give it up, which are either your gender or sexual orientation, because there's so much pressure being put there. And because there's no representation, and all the representation mainly in those communities is that it's a Western invention, it's a modern thing, you don't know where to go. You can't see someone that looks like you or speaks like you, has a name like you. So I'm hoping my presence on this panel hopefully is a forerunner for many other people to come up and stand up and have a voice and a face.
Thanks, Abba. Really powerful words, and it's great that you're able to be here. I've heard you talk so eloquently on this topic many times, and really fantastic to have you as part of this panel, sharing such a valuable and diverse experience once again. Our final panelist is, I'm very pleased to introduce Ro Johnson. Ro is an out and proud trans woman and passionate advocate for equality and inclusion across all intersections. Ro is also a survivor of conversion practices. And Ro, my question to you, in helping to draw a lot of this panel discussion towards a close today, is what do conversion ideology and practices look like for trans people of faith?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Adam. I think it's a really, the first thing I would preface is that I don't consider myself a person of faith. I consider myself a person with faith history. When I was born into my family, I was meant to be the very image of a modern evangelical. My all across my family history are missionaries, people that were involved in the stolen generation, people who were ministers and pastors and the like. And so that was what I was meant to be. Unfortunately for me, at the age of 3, I came out to my parents as trans. Well, I didn't know what I was coming out as. I just knew who I was and how I understood myself to be. And so I think the reason I mention that is not to say, I was young and look at me, wow, you came out at 3, whoopee-doo, is that I think for trans people, the beginning and the antecedents of those conversion ideologies start very, very young. From that moment. And I think, I've really got 3 words about this. Is for trans folk, it's ideology, 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 and it comes from, particularly for those people that come from faith backgrounds, it comes from the very the most intimate part of your life, your family, first and foremost, and then it moves through all the different walks of life, through your church, through your connections, often through your school, particularly if, like Abba, you're part of a religious context in your schooling. It comes through there. We see it consistently, we see it constantly in the media. Trans people are bombarded with ideology, ideology, ideology. I mean, we can talk about practices all we like, and they're going to be very different for every different person, and they're going to be very different depending on when that happened. I'm an old cow, so I'm 50, so I was 1973 when that happened for me, and that was met with violence and sexual violence. But that ideology was and sorry, I should have put a trigger warning there, I apologize, everyone. that ideology became part of every single thing I did, became a part of the sports I was allowed to play. It became a part of the hobbies I was allowed to do, the friends I was allowed to have. It became part of that. It became, you know, I wasn't allowed to be part of mixed groups in faith communities. I always had to be part of the boys group. You know, all of those things, they're it's a constant bombardment, and any deviation was met with violence. But not just violence, but also, well, not just physical violence, but psychological violence, verbal violence, financial violence, all of those things compound, you know, and I think I don't think I'm unique, but I'm not necessarily common in that for me, the response to that for survival was to repress who I was, to try and play out a role of the person that I wasn't. And in so doing, have very detrimental impacts on my own mental health, but also very detrimental impacts on the people that I was connected with around. You know, I tried pretty hard. I did a good job of trying to be the person that they told me I was. You know, I was in two straight marriages, and I'm sure that those marriages have had an impact on those people that I'm part of. You know, I'm currently in a situation where, because of that impact, my former partner has essentially made it impossible for me to have contact with my children, and you know, there's a whole lot of things. So I think I think one of the really key things for trans people in this space is that conversion ideology, until you break out of it, break out of those connections, it's lifelong. It starts from that moment, and even when we break out of it, we're constantly bombarded with media that, whilst that media isn't religious, often isn't religious, although, you know, we see through the ACL and Binary and organisations like that there's that religious connection. But that media, whether it's media in the term of newspapers, whether it's media in terms of social media, whether it's media in terms of film and television, the constant message is continued: you're broken, you're not, who you are is not okay. You can't be who you are because it's perverted. We're often equated as pedophiles, as predators looking to invade spaces that aren't ours. You know, all of those things are constantly bombarded. And the thing, even though they're not religious, they connect back to the religious messaging that was so inherent in our experiences growing up. You know, for me, I tried to maintain that. You know, it took me 45 years to get beyond repression. It took me 45 years to break out of the fact that you have to pretend to be something you're not, and suppress and repress who you are. And so there's a hell of a lot of history there. There's a hell of a lot of messaging there that continue, that, you know, you have to counter all the time. You have to counter all the time, and it's, I don't want to pretend that the trans experience is better or worse than what it is for, whether that be other gender diverse people or whether that be gay, lesbian, bi plus folk at all. But I think it is a different. I think there's some differences and some nuances in there that because they become ingrained at such a formative period of our childhood, often, that they become harder to break out of. I think, you know, that's my perspective. It's not a research-based or science-based perspective. That's my feeling and perspective. And I think it's what I'm really thrilled about is the fact that that many people have advocated so strongly that this is not a gay conversion therapy bill. This is a bill to protect all of our communities. And, you know, and let's be honest, many of us have multiple identities. You know, many of us aren't just trans, or we're not just lesbian, or we're not just bi. you know, I also live with disability, and you know, so I'm very interested in intersectionality and how those things correlate. And look, perhaps the reason I came out was because of my disability. I was a little less constrained by the social mores, and maybe if I wasn't, I wouldn't have come out and put myself at that risk. But the reality is that's what happened. And the reality is that's what my life has been. You know, not to be all sad and gloomy, you know, I have an amazing life now. I've come out. I have an amazing queer community to be a part of. I have amazing friends. I have an amazing partner. You know, you know, for the last year, I've been in my first queer relationship, and it's amazing. And I've been able to engage over the last few years into the queer community and found that, you know, found my people, found my, not wanting to be culturally inappropriate, but I'm not sure of what a better word is, found my tribe, I guess. And you know, this tribe, if you like, that I was warned about and told were perverted and horrible and all of these things, are actually the most life-affirming and wonderful group of people that I could ever have hoped to have come into contact with. So, you know, I think one of the really key things to take away from all of that, and sorry, I've probably raved on for too long, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We can come out of this. We can thrive. We can live positive, productive, and fantastic lives. And this bill is something that will actually be a support to that happening.
Bro, that was that was wonderful. Thank you so much. The kind of notion about finding your people and this forum, this kind of group being the place where you can feel affirmed in a way that wasn't and hasn't been the case within religious and faith communities, I think is a kind of really nice takeaway from this whole event. And hopefully there'll be other people watching who will feel more connected into a peer support network as a result of coming along to this than perhaps they were before. We have run a few minutes over, for which I do apologize for everyone who's looking to get off to eat their dinner. I'm grateful to Ghassan, who's been answering rather a range of technical questions that have come in through the Q&A function about the legislation while other panelists have been speaking. I do want to round out the session, if you're going to hold you for just 2 or 3 minutes longer, with a bit more of an action-oriented question that I'll ask that any panelist may wish to answer. Which is simply, what actions can people take to ensure that this bill will pass? Perhaps, and if the panelists can condense their answers into 20 words, or certainly no more than 20 seconds, or fewer if you possibly can, your very pithy thing, what should people be doing? Alex, can I go to you first?
If you're a person of faith, a faith leader, or know anyone who fits into those brackets that supports this bill, raise your voice. We need your voice to raise up loud, to help combat other faith leaders and people's voices that are negative and anti the bill.
Thanks, Alex, that's great. Aisha?
I think, solidarity, and understand that this is not just a gender or issue, this is a human rights issue. So you really have to take part of it, and also we won't be erased.
Fantastic, thank you. Percy?
I'd say if you're in the queer community, support the fact that queer people of faith exist, and we want to exist and maintain our faith. And yeah, like religious freedom for us is very important as well. The fact that we get to practice our faith in peace and safety.
Fantastic point. We are a diverse community and always need to be respectful of that. Abba, in no more than 15 seconds.
I don't know how to add to all the great suggestions.
That's okay.
But just 2 quick things. If you're a person of faith, I think prayer is helpful, not just prayer, just in words, but actually doing something about it. And also representation is key.
Fantastic. And Ro?
Hi, I think I would agree with everything everyone said on that, but I would say if you, you know, raise your voice, write to the politicians, share the resources. If you're not familiar with the SOGI statement, get on there and read it. Get onto the legislation and read it. You know, at least have an understanding from that layperson's point of view. If you're an ally, we need you.
Great.
If you're an ally and you're not a queer person, we ask you to stand in the gap for us. We need you. We would not have achieved marriage equality without you, and we won't achieve this without you. So please stand in the gap for us.
Thank you so much for that. And the last two or three, I think, if I've missed anyone, try and keep them brief. Nicole, anything further?
I would just add, tell the stories of the effects of conversion practice and ideologies. Stories of lived experience shape our worldview and perception. Tell them to the religious leaders, tell them to the political leaders, and stay safe when doing so.
A good point. Statistics help, but stories are usually what changes opinions and minds. Ghassan.
Look, I just want to say thank you. I was privileged to hear that, and I don't think it's appropriate for me I'll just leave it with the survivors and
Sure.
echo their words.
Yeah, great, fantastic, thank you. Nathan.
Yeah, firstly, if people have questions about the bill, reach out and ask people who know about it. You know, spreading information that's a bit off about it can cause some problems and unnecessary fear. Amnesty International, go to their website and look at the letter writing campaign with model letters for members of parliament in other states and territories. Write to your MPs directly, they want to know. And if you're in a position of authority or influence in the queer or faith communities, and people ask you questions about conversion practices, defer to survivors, refer them to SOGI Survivors and Brave Network, and survivors are there to share their stories.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, Nathan. And last but not least, Chris.
I would say something very practical. I echo what everybody has been saying, but you can always share that the comic that we showed you in that, you can always share that. That's going to be on a lot of social media from SOGI Survivors and Brave and Amnesty. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys, for all of those suggestions. This is really a remarkable piece of legislation. It might require some polishing and tinkering around the edges, but I think it's something that we can, I think there's a lot of support from this group. Certainly I seem to have heard, and we need to ensure this passes. And there's a lot of good ideas there that have come from this expert group about what we can all be doing as a community to ensure that it makes its way successfully through Parliament over the next couple of weeks. I want to round out by thanking everyone for participating, and thank you to all of those watching at home, and thank you for sticking with us the extra 10 minutes so we could hear these final closing words from our esteemed speakers. So thank you to Aisha, to Ro, Nathan, Percy, Abba, Alex, Nicole, Chris, and Ghassan. Thank you also to Jonathan Meddings from Thorne Harbour. For his work in putting the panel together today, and also to Mary Sayers for convening this forum for us. I just want to end, I'm conscious that there's been a lot of very challenging material that's been discussed this evening, and I would like to just remind everyone that if it has raised any issues for you, that both Thorne Harbour Health and Switchboard have counselling services available. You can visit thorneharbour.org, or you can call Switchboard on 1-800-729-367. But for now, once again, a final thank you to all of our panelists and speakers, and to all of you for participating at home and asking and posing so many interesting questions and comments as we've gone through. I look forward to seeing you, hopefully in person one day, if such things become possible, at another Thorne Harbour event or another LGBTIQA+ sector event in the future as well. Thanks, everyone.